This is a Radboud Reflects podcast.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joy for all your nations rise, join the triumph of the skies. With angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
Hey Lisbeth, are you already preparing for Christmas?
Well, actually, yes. Yesterday I've taken our boxes from the attic and unwrapped the whole nativity scene. And together with my children, we've put the little figures in its right place. The sheep and the shepherds, of course, the three wise men. And it always gives me a really warm feeling. Christmas is coming soon. What about you?
Well, in all honesty, we don't even have a Christmas tree. But I do remember that as a child I used to play with the nativity scene, but then I would also put my Lego figures in it. And then my grandpa would get kind of grumpy and he would say, well, Chide, those figures, they shouldn't be there. They aren't part of the nativity play.
Yeah, that's really funny because, well, if you come to think of it, this whole nativity story, of course, it's so old. And all those figures that we take for granted, the three wise men and their camels, the shepherds and the sheep, the angels, how do we know that they actually were there?
I honestly do not know, but I think it's worthwhile to find out what the origins of the nativity story are. So let's see whether we can do that. Hi, my name is Chide Tempels, and together with my colleague Lisbeth Jansen, we will be exploring the origins of the nativity story. We'll be doing so together with Oxford theologian John Barton, who knows a lot about the Bible, and we asked him everything we always wanted to know about the origins of Christmas. So Lisbeth, I just got off the phone with John Barton. There were many things I asked him, and there were many answers, but I was wondering whether there was one specific element you were most keen to know about.
Well, what always fascinates me is the fact that we think that the nativity story is somehow coherent. There's one story. But if you go and look in the Bible, you will see that there are at least two different stories. And then two of the Gospels, they don't even mention the birth of Christ. So how come?
Well, that's just one of the things I asked him, so let's listen to that.
Well, the differences are very large. The Gospel of Marc, which is almost certainly the first Gospel to have been written, doesn't have a nativity story at all. It starts with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist as an adult. And the Gospel of John doesn't have a nativity story either. It talks about the incarnation of the Word of God at the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. And it doesn't have any story of Jesus' birth at all. And indeed, there's no other reference to the birth of Jesus in the New Testament, apart from Paul's letter to the Galatians, which simply says that God sent his son born of a woman, but gives no more details. So all the nativity stories we have are in either Matthew or Luke. And in Matthew, we have the impression that Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. After the birth and after the wise men have come to visit, they flee to Egypt. Then they come back, but they're warned in a dream not to go back to Bethlehem, so they go to Nazareth and settle down there. In the version in St. Luke, they live in Nazareth, and that's where all the events happen until they go to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem for the census. And that's where the birth of Jesus takes place. And then they return to Nazareth afterwards. Luke has the story of the shepherds watching their flocks by night and seeing the angel of the Lord. And Matthew has the three wise men, the Magi or astrologers who come from the east. So they don't occur in the same gospel. One of the things I often ask really beginning students who are studying the Bible is, what did the wise men say to the shepherds? And of course, the answer is the Gospel doesn't tell us that, because one is in one Gospel and one is in the other. So there are very large differences between them. And we have to assume, I think, that stories about Jesus' birth only started to circulate after the time when the Gospel of Mark was written, and that Matthew and Luke acquired entirely different versions of them. Some would suggest even that Matthew and Luke made up their nativity stories because there was an interest in how Jesus had come into being in the first place, and that maybe they are both legendary versions of stories which no one knew the truth about. That would perhaps be rather more skeptical than most biblical scholars would be about these stories. But they are different from things in the rest of the Gospel. And the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and Luke resume at the place where Mark starts, with the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. And the nativity stories are sort of rather separate prologues to the two Gospels. So it's all quite mysterious.
So, Lisbeth, does this answer your question?
Yes, it does actually. And I found it particularly interesting to hear that apparently these stories about the birth of Jesus only developed after the first Gospel, so the Gospel of Mark, had already been written. So that explains why it's not there. And now that I come to think of it, there's another element of the Nativity story that has been an inspiration for even songs, Mary traveling on the donkey. But is that in any of the Gospels? I don't think so. Where did it come from?
Well, John Barton referred to that, and he said it was in the Gospel of James. So let's listen to what he had to say about that.
Well, there are a number of Gospels, or things that are said to be Gospels, that come from the second or even third century of our era, so later than the Gospels in the New Testament, and which embroider the stories of Jesus quite considerably. And the infancy Gospel of James is a particularly good example, probably from the late 2nd century. But it's there that we have a number of details which most people think are in the Gospels in the New Testament. For example, Mary riding on a donkey, Joseph as an old man who already has other children, Jesus' birthplace, the manger, being in a cave, which has become the normal accepted position in the Orthodox churches, in the Greek Orthodox Church. A number of other details which we all know, on the ox and the ass in the stable. And we all know those things from the Nativity story, but they're not actually in the New Testament. They are in the infancy Gospel of James, which therefore, though it's not canonical, it's not part of the Bible, has exercised an enormous influence on how people actually think about the Nativity.
So John Barton just told us that there are various crucial elements that I thought were part and parcel of the Nativity story, that they are in fact not from the Bible, but from different kinds of Gospels that are not in the Bible as we know it. So that struck me, but I was also wondering about Jesus' parents, because Mary is often depicted as this young woman, while Joseph, on the other hand, when you look at paintings, he's often depicted as an old man. And I was wondering why that was the case.
There's absolutely no suggestion in the Gospels that he was an old man, but he is an old man again in the infancy Gospel of James, where he appears as an old man. I think the reasoning is Jesus is said in the Gospels to have brothers and sisters. That appears in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that he has brothers and sisters. Now, the early church, of course, believed very strongly in the virgin birth of Jesus, and they tended to believe that Mary remained a virgin not just before Jesus' birth, but after it too. In other words, that she and Joseph had no kind of intercourse, and therefore she couldn't have had any more children. So the argument was that if Jesus has brothers and sisters, they must be his brothers and sisters by Joseph's earlier marriage, which in turn implies that Joseph is rather older than you might think he would be. I think that's how the line of reasoning worked. But of course, if one doesn't believe that Mary was, as the Catholic Church says, a perpetual virgin, but went on to have other children, then the problem falls away, and we don't need to make Joseph an old man in order to account for his brothers and sisters.
Well, Chida, I can't stop thinking about one of the practical problems that I have every year when setting up my nativity scene, and that is the star. What to do with it. You want it up in the air, so to say, but how do you do that? You can glue it on the stable, but that's not very nice. And besides, when you look at the story, the star was leading the way for the wise men or the kings. So how to do that? Did Barton have anything to say about the star?
Yes. Well, the answer is, again, I think in terms of the fulfillment of prophecy, because there's a prophecy in the book of Numbers, the fourth book of Moses, which says that a star will arise from Jacob. And this was taken in New Testament times as a messianic prophecy that the star was the Messiah. And a Jewish leader in the early 2nd century called Bar Kokhba was renamed Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star, because he was thought to be a fulfillment of that prophecy. And in a similar way, Christians thought that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy. And on that basis, the story of the star is perhaps a reference to that prophecy. The problem with the star, of course, as people have long noticed, is that the star does things a star can't do. It travels ahead of the wise men and stops over the stable, which is an impossible idea. I mean, it would have to mean something more metaphorical. And people go through lots of trouble to try and work out whether there was a comet at just that time and this kind of thing. But I think it's really a legendary star myself, based on the prophecy in Numbers.
Well, I must say I'm relieved to hear that even an Oxford professor has a problem with the star, although his is slightly different from mine.
What I was wondering in regard to the star is, of course, that the star was being chased or being followed by 3 kings, but they're often referred to, as kings, and then they are referred to as wise men, and then they are referred to as mages, and they are supposed to come from the east. So that still raises a lot of questions about who were these guys.
It is a reference to the prophecy about the kings, though actually Matthew doesn't identify them as kings, but just as magoi, mages, possibly astrologers. So it doesn't correspond exactly with the prophecy it's meant to fulfill. But I think the prophecy is the source of, possibly the source of the story itself, in a sense that the story I'm afraid I take to be a legend about all the wise of the earth coming to worship Jesus, which symbolically is represented by these wise men bringing gifts. There are, of course, also in the story not said to be 3 wise men. They bring 3 different gifts, but it doesn't say how many wise men there are. So that's, again, an influence from the story. But they would, Matthew must have conceived them as sages, wise people coming from the east, from a sort of imaginary land to the east where the wise come from. But if it were a really true story, we would have to say, well, where would they actually have come from in real terms? And it's very, very difficult to say, really.
Oh, wow. So actually the 3 wise men, they symbolize all the wise men of the earth coming to worship Jesus. Now, I'm wondering, what about the shepherds? Do they also have a symbolic meaning?
The shepherds, the best explanation I've ever come across, and I don't think it's all that good an explanation even so, is that Luke is particularly interested in his gospel in Jesus' involvement with the poor and outcasts and those of low social standing. And shepherds in Judean society at that time were of quite low social standing. And by saying that the angel of the Lord appeared to shepherds, he's saying a remarkable thing, that God is actually willing to communicate with people who are not, nobles or people in government or kings, but with lowly shepherds. And a lot of our Christmas hymns and carols have made something of that. This is God coming down to the level of the shepherds. And I think it could be the case that Luke particularly wants to emphasize God appearing to the lowly. So it's a possible explanation, but that, of course, won't in itself get you the detail of the shepherds with their flocks by night, and the angel of the Lord appearing to them and so on. But it may be partly an explanation of why Luke highlights the shepherds where Matthew highlights the Magi.
So John Barton just discussed how Jesus is especially seen as a savior for people in the margins, but we were also wondering to what extent there are similar stories in the Bible that also discuss the coming or the presence of a savior.
Well, there are certainly stories about the birth of a leader. In the book of Judges, particularly, there's the story of how Samson came to be born. Samson, the great person who defeats the Philistines. And there's a story of an angel appearing to Samson's parents and telling them that this child is going to be born. And the angel appears, first of all, as a man in human guise. But then when he's finished talking to them, he ascends in a flame to heaven, from which they know he's an angel. And that seems to me to have quite a lot of similarities. And in fact, particularly the stories in Luke are actually told in a Greek style, which is different from the rest of the Gospel and is quite like the style of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Bible. And it does seem as though he at least has modelled some of his stories about the birth of Jesus on stories of the birth of leaders in the Old Testament. So that there is that kind of resemblance between the birth stories and the stories of the birth of others. Because it's quite a common theme in the Old Testament that when great people are born, there are signs or portents which give a clue to the fact that somebody important is being born. So I think it does fit a biblical pattern. And you do see here Jesus being, to some extent, moulded into the shape of one of Israel's great deliverers in the past. It may be, I think it is the case, that Jesus was actually, in origin, a much more ordinary figure than that, and that Christians came to believe his identity as the Son of God because of how impressed they were with what he did and said, and especially with the death and resurrection, rather than because his birth had been miraculous. So I think the miraculous birth is part of building up someone whom we've already come to revere so greatly. And that happens in the biographies of many leaders in all kinds of different religions.
Let's reflect on that a bit more, because I think he just said two different things. First of all, so the prophecy of the new messiahs is in line with other stories from the Old Testament, saying that a great leader is born, and at the same time, great leaders need an interesting nativity story. So probably the whole nativity story of Jesus was construed because his life was so impressive. So first we had the stories about his life, and then afterwards came the nativity stories. Wow, Chida, well, we have now heard a lot about things in the nativity story that were not as I thought they were. Let's take something very basic. December 25th, the birth of Christ. That should be true, right?
Well, I hate to break it to you, Lisbeth, but that's not true either.
This is a very mysterious issue. like so many of the things we've been discussing. The first evidence for a feast of the Nativity of Jesus comes from the 3rd century of our era, the 4th century of our era, the 360s, that kind of period. Before that, all the things to do with Jesus were celebrated together at Easter. And the separating out of a special feast of the Nativity happens in the 4th century. And it seems to have happened in this way, that the first feast to be established was what we now call Epiphany, the 6th of January. And the celebration of the 25th of December comes later, and no one knows quite why. One very popular theory is that it corresponds to some Roman midwinter festival, and that that was being, as it were, taken over, and you might say baptized by the Christians as a feast of the birth of Jesus. But I think that theory is now largely discarded by those who studied this. So no one quite knows why the 25th of December was eventually fixed on. But what is the case is that Epiphany is the older feast, and that was adopted also in the West. In the East, it remains the major festival of the incarnation of Jesus, the 6th of January, though Eastern churches also borrowed 25th of December from the Western churches. So in origin, one is an Eastern, one a Western feast, but the 25th of December has predominated in the West since certainly the Middle Ages as the major festival, and Epiphany is a rather slightly less important one, but it's the opposite way around in the churches of the East. So, but how either date was fixed on is, I think, to be honest, entirely mysterious.
So Christmas is being celebrated all over the world. And the final question we asked John Barton is, why this is the case? Why are people celebrating Christmas?
Well, I think the way I've been approaching it is very much historically to try and say, why did people start to get interested in the Nativity of Jesus? And the answer, of course, is because of what he turned into. I mean, because of what he became as an adult. And they wouldn't have had any interest in either finding out or inventing stories about how Jesus came to be born had Jesus not already been a very central, important figure for them. And I think myself that the stories show, above all, the enormous value that the early Christians placed on Jesus. And they did so because of the kind of character he had, which shines through in all Gospels, of all the sort of things that have now become commonplace as descriptions of him, but which were remarkable at the time. His care for the downtrodden and needy and poor, and also his emphasis on a particular benign set of human values, in pursuit of which he was actually prepared to go to his death. And I think the Jesus who was crucified and who Christians believed rose again was the basis on which people then became interested in saying, yes, but what were his real origins? Where did he actually spring from? And then we get the stories about the birth. So my own feeling is that the stories we read at Christmas are important because they point us to Jesus the man rather than the baby lying in the manger.
So that's the very last question we posed to John Barton, and we are very happy that he was willing to share his knowledge and ideas with us, and we honestly hope that in 2021 he might be able to come to Nijmegen to give a public lecture.
I really learned a lot today. What about you, Chida? Was there anything that struck you most?
Well, yeah, what struck me most is I think the fact that there are indeed various interpretations of the gospel. Because I of course heard about the gospel when I was at Christian primary school, but then there just was one story. There was a story that included the kings, it included the shepherds, it included baby Jesus. And talking to John Barton just really cleared that up, that there's not just one story. That really struck me. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, I particularly liked what he said about the meaning of Jesus for the shepherds, that they were those with a socially low status, and that Matthew wrote his gospel especially to say that Jesus is there for those in the margins. And I think with that, he emphasized that the story of Christmas, that the Nativity story, still has a very important meaning for us today too.
This concludes our special Christmas podcast that was made by Radboud Reflects and DEZINNEN. We hope you enjoyed it. We sure did. And did you notice that at the start of the podcast you heard a jingle? The jingle was made by Sanne Groen and our colleagues Dave Willems and Marc Slors. You will hear them again at the end of this podcast, but not before. Lisbeth and I have wished you a very Merry Christmas. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again in 2021.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful all your nations rise, join the triumph of the skies. With angelic hosts proclaim, Christ is born.